my understanding of the documentary evidence is that the war was not a planned war. It certainly was not a planned war in the sense of a long-term plan on the Israeli side. As late as April of 1967, Israeli military intelligence was telling the generals and the politicians that no war was likely with the Arab states within the next 8 to 10 years. I can't swear to the fact that the war was not planned on the side of Nasser, but my impression or my hypothesis looking at the evidence is that nobody was more surprised than Gamal Abdel Nasser when the UN agreed to remove its troops from the Sinai. It seems to me much more likely that Nasser had intended to demonstrate solidarity with Syria by making this demand, that he expected that the UN would say no, and that he could go home quietly and say, well, I was willing to stand with my Arab brothers, but what can you do? The United Nations got in my way. Instead, you thought surprised him. The Egyptian army marched to the border. A military coalition was created, and on June 5th, 1967, the Israeli government decided to launch a preemptive strike. Once the war began, as often happens, war is chaotic. Generals defied, the defense minister defied the cabinet in certain cases. Generals went further than the defense minister told them to. Sometimes lieutenants went further than the generals had told them to. And at the end of the war, Israel found itself in control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. This did not fit with von Clausewitz's principles in his classic book on war. War, according to von Clausewitz, is supposed to be policy by other means. In this case, the war had happened, and now the policy had to be written around it. Was the purpose of the war, what was the purpose of these conquests? The cabinet met first on this on June 19th, 1967. The first consensus that was reached was that there would be no repeat of what had happened after the 1956 Sinai crisis, when Israel had pulled back from the Sinai without a formal peace. So a secret offer was made via the United States to Egypt and Syria to return nearly to the international border in return for full, formal, signed peace agreements and full recognition of Israel. This is one of those classic figure ground. It's good for postmodern narrative analyzing this decision. Was this a very dovish decision? In fact, the government was offering to give up virtually all the territory it had captured from Syria and Egypt in return for peace. It can also be read, and I think both readings are correct, they complement each other, as the government saying, if we're going to pull back, we're going to demand a much more solid diplomatic arrangement than what followed the 1956 war. We will pull back, but only in return for recognition and peace. In any case, the offer was passed on to Washington, which passed it on to Cairo and Damascus, and at that point it was turned down. It's an interesting fact that it was turned down then because essentially that formula is what eventually was the basis of the 1979 peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, and is really what's on the table right now in the on-again, off-again negotiations between Israel and Syria. So even though it didn't happen at the time, it remained in the background. The biggest question, however, for the Israeli government was the West Bank. And the conflict there, very simply, was between the desire to have the land and the fact that a large Palestinian population lived there. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol at the time was known for saying that with the war, Israel got a wonderful dowry. The problem is that with the dowry comes the bride. There was, in fact, a proposal for a Palestinian state to be established in the West Bank, which was the first documented record of this as it came from military intelligence before the ceasefire was announced. There were discussions of it immediately afterwards. What's very interesting is that it was rejected in Israeli policymaking circles because it was seen as a colonial suggestion. In other words, the presumption was that any Palestinian state established in the wake of the war would be seen as an Israeli protectorate, and the age of colonial protectorates had passed. So this idea was taken off the table. In that June 19th, 1967 discussion, in the cabinet, Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapira, who was from the then ruling Mapai party, the party of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, said that holding the West Bank with its Arab population, there's a nomenclature problem here which I should address. In Israeli records of the time, the word Palestinian isn't used. And I remember even in the 80s when I started as a journalist, the arguments on the news desks between the use of the word Arab and the use of the word Palestinian. So I get into a little bit of a historian's anachronism dilemma. When I'm talking of the situation there, in today's nomenclature, and today's political awareness, we're talking about the Palestinian population. When I'm quoting the text always say Arab. And there are political reasons for that I can explain later, but if I'm going back and forth between the two terms, please understand that historians are people who don't know where they're living, whether it's now or 50 years ago, and so I'm sort of trading the nomenclature from the two times. In any case, Shapiro said that holding the West Bank with its Arab population and not giving them full political rights, including the vote, was impossible, quote, in a time of decolonialization. That is to say, doing so would be seen as a colonial act. On the other hand, he said, if we give full political rights and the vote to the people living there, quote, we're done with the Zionist enterprise, unquote, because the goal of Zionism was to create a state with a Jewish majority, and it would no longer be a state with a Jewish majority. It would become a binational state. So Shapiro was against, he made basically the argument for not holding on, for not keeping the West Bank under Israeli control. There was also a secret report written that summer by Levi Eshkol appointed several interlocking committees of top security, intelligence, and diplomatic officials to examine policy options for the future of the West Bank. The final report, delivered late in July 1967, advised him that the government would have to act quickly to decide the future of the West Bank because, quote, internationally the impression is likely to be that we are maintaining a colonial regime, end quote. So these are documents from inside of the Israeli government. These are not criticisms voiced in Paris or Berkeley or, for that matter, Cairo. These were the discussions that were going on inside of the Israeli government. If this was so clear, what's happened? Why wasn't there a very quick move to arrange a pullout? Well, in the records and in the psychology of the time, I think there were three reasons that stood in the way in the discussions. Two that came up explicitly in discussions and one more that didn't, but I think was a powerful factor that prevented a decision toward withdrawal, toward a making, essentially the question was, should we make the same offer to Jordan that we made to Syria and Egypt, full withdrawal in return for full peace? One factor was a security issue. Before the 1967 war, Israel thought that it had a modus vivendi worked out with King Hussein of Jordan. There was a deep sense of disappointment and even of betrayal that Hussein had joined the war. Again, I think there's a whole set of complex reasons within intra-Arab politics why Hussein felt that he had no choice but to do that. But from the Israeli point of view, this was perfidy. We thought we had everything worked out with Hussein, and he joined. So now we have to take much more seriously the fact that Israel is a narrow waist that's 9 miles, 15 kilometers wide, and there was a desire, particularly among the people who came out of the security establishment, for what they called strategic depth, which the West Bank would provide. A second aspect of it was the historical nationalist reason. Many of the spots within the West Bank, Bethlehem, Hebron, Shiloh, other places like this, were associated in national memory with biblical history. Every Israeli secular religious learns the Bible as the national epic. And so here were all these places connected with the national story. This was a very powerful factor. It was a highly mobilized society politically, much more so than today. And that kind of historical factor was very strong. A third factor was, one must remember that it was only 19 years since 1948. The great majority of the people who were leaders of Israel in 1967 were people who had grown up, had come of age in mandatory Palestine. They had mostly come of age in youth movements that encouraged an intense, emotional, passionate relationship with the land, with the countryside. The most explicit expression of this was constant hiking through the countryside, learning the land with your feet. The land which was perceived as being the one indivisible land had been divided as a result of the 1948 war. Now it was under Jewish control, and it was very difficult for people emotionally for these leaders emotionally to think of dividing it again. It was sort of like, metaphorically speaking, as if you'd been reunited with your high school girlfriend